And this morning, we're going to have a conversation about South Africa's trade with the US, particularly about our trade under the African Growth and Opportunities Act, and then the bulk of our trade, which does not, in fact, sit under this preferential system. So we're going to start with just a very, very brief evolution of AGOA. And that truly doesn't tell a complete story, but AGOA is a US piece of legislation, and that's important to bear in mind. This is not a trade agreement. It's a US piece of legislation giving preferential access to the US market for African states. Just before I go on, Pumalelo, are we recording?
Yes, we are.
Oh, we are. Excellent. So the evolution of this begins in the late 90s under President Bill Clinton. And the mood in the US at that time, justifiably so, I think, is that aid into Africa is not working as well as intended. There's a lot of corruption. There are a lot of politicians and other officials which are diluting the effect of this by pocketing some of that money. And there's the swinging view that says a better option would be to open up the US market. And this is supported by quite a number of African economists who say far better to open up the US market, let product in, rather than simply sending over aid money. And so we see the first version of AGOA created in 2000, and this gives access for African states into the US. This comes to an end at the end of 2015. It's then extended by 10 years. And there are a couple of characteristics of the version 2 version of AGOA that are important. There's a new rebate is created on chicken, bone-in chicken out of the US, and 60-something thousand tons of chicken are allowed into South Africa, particularly, without attracting the anti-dumping duty, which remains in place till today on US chicken. There's a side agreement on chicken and pork. These side agreements deal with sanitary issues on these products. They're very technical, so we're not going to spend too much time on them, but they allow the better flow of these products. But important, the new version of AGOA allows selective suspension of certain benefits. So the first version of AGOA was a little more blunt. You could suspend a country or not suspend, and that could have fairly dire consequences for that country. AGOA evolves into something politically a lot more powerful, because you can selectively suspend. You don't have to make this call of whether you're going to suspend all of the benefits. And this is used to great effect, in fact, to create the rebate. And so there's this dispute happening at the end of 2015. Rob Davies, leading the charge with the South African Poultry Association, do not want to see any American chicken enter the market. And then President Obama briefly suspends South Africa's benefits into the US on the automotive industry. And that creates a very quick wake up, and we find ourselves with this chicken rebate. And very quickly, the suspension is again lifted. We're now dealing with that version of AGOA, which will expire at the end of 2025 currently, unless it is extended. And we're not sure if it is going to be extended or not. However, if it is extended, it's looking increasingly unlikely that South Africa will benefit from an extended AGOA. We could, and we should still argue and lobby for it, which I'll get to a little bit later. But right now, if working on the assumption that AGOA will end at the end of 2025, how does the world look at that point for us? And what does the US market look like? So AGOA doesn't specifically require anything from the countries that it offers preferences to. It says you should play nice with American companies. You should protect intellectual property. You should run a democratic system. You shouldn't steal elections and so on. But South Africa has had a strange relationship with AGOA. On the one hand, we like the idea of AGOA. On the other hand, the South African government is not always entirely comfortable with the US. And so we see this popping up in some of the comments made, We're not going to spend half the presentation going through these comments, but let me quickly pop one up. This comes from Minister Gwede Mantashe, saying those meetings in the American embassy are about nothing else other than mobilization for regime change. We're aware of a program that takes young people to the United States for 6 weeks, brings them back and plants them everywhere. And there are all kinds of versions of these sorts of comments made by government officials. Sometimes they would say they're not making it in their official capacity, they're writing in their personal capacity. But I certainly don't think comments like this help us as we enter the stage where we have to decide what our relationship with the US looks like from a trade perspective. Minister Ibrahim Patel bemoaned the fact that out of 1,835 tariff lines under AGOA, Sub-Saharan Africa was only using 748 or 40%. In fact, that doesn't begin to tell the full story, which we'll get into in a moment. Indeed, we only use 13% of the tariff lines under the bigger generalized system of preferences. So GSP precedes AGOA, and it's a broader system, but AGOA has added to that by putting in these additional products that GSP didn't cover. GSP is also not an American system, so it exists in other jurisdictions as well. We are here to discuss how to turn that around, to identify challenges, and to take steps to increase utilization of AGOA preferences, as well as to deepen trade and investment relationships between Africa and the US. So this was said by Minister Patel in 2019. We're going to look at some data to try to understand how our utilization of AGOA has improved over the period. So when we look at the data, you will see the data begins in 2010. We do have access to data back to 2000, but the structural changes to the tariff book make use of that data simply not ideal. So significant changes happened, particularly at SARS, on how they recorded export statistics. And before 2010, the data is no longer comparative, so we've dropped it. But that's enough time. That's a full 12 years that we can look at. So let's have a look at South Africa's total exports to the US in US dollars. So the green bar at the bottom is every other country besides the US and the EU. And we've placed the EU onto this chart because the EU is our biggest single trading partner for both imports and exports. We have a trade agreement with the US, which is of course very different to AGOA because we reciprocate and give preferential access to the EU, where we don't with the US. But it is an interesting point of comparison. And so we're going to stick with inserting the EU into these charts as well where necessary. So what you'll find is, and we've noted this in US dollars, when we want to feel better about ourselves, we'll put some of the charts up in rands, because of course that just looks better. But sadly, it's just a reflection of our depreciated currency. So importantly, the US accounted for 11% of our exports in 2010 and accounts for 15%. And of course, you can see that the orange block, the 15% block, is quite a bit bigger than the 11% was. So that has grown, but not grown, for example, proportionately to our European trade. On the other hand, has done better than our trade with the rest of the world. Again, we're not going to put up at this point the rand-based values of this, but the rand pattern, of course, just looks like a more steady increase over that period. So let's have a look at our pattern of trade with the US. So the top 10 products that we export are these over here. So I apologize for how busy this chart is, but I'm going to draw your attention to the important bits you need to look at. So the first part of this we're going to look at is the blue part right at the bottom, the part of the bar that just grows and grows like crazy. That is platinum in all kinds of varieties, but that is platinum that is being exported. And platinum by far has been the biggest winner of exports into the US and also has nothing at all to do with AGOA. And you'll see minerals truly over-feature in our trade with the US. Second on the list, predictably, is vehicles. Vehicles have done well, and we would expect it to do well. But vehicles is always complicated to wrestle with, because vehicles are subsidized and heavily so. If we stripped out the subsidy, if we said, what is the cost of that access? It's not insignificant. This is not to say the subsidies and support from government should not be there, but merely that it does come with the cost to the public to have those exports occur. Centrifuges, by the way, before you get too excited, are mostly catalytic converters, and that again is just platinum in another form. And so if you have a look at our trade, you can see very quickly that the trade is heavily weighted towards very basic product. That's a curiosity, because the US is a sophisticated market. It's a market we should be more competitive in with our manufactured goods, but this is clearly not reflected in our export trade. The flip side of looking at that would be to say, we are extremely good miners, and our mining sector understands how to mine competitively, and so they've reaped the benefits. We also see aluminium plates, sheets, and strip, and a lot of that would have, or at least a portion of that, would have gone to the Tesla company in the US, but our aluminium certainly has also done well. It did hit a little bit of a wobble with President Trump and his duties on aluminium and steel, but for the most part, aluminium has still done relatively well. So if you look at this chart, if you take the 2021 bar, that bar you are looking at is in fact that little 15% that you see at the top on this chart. That is that 15% broken out. And you can see here, our trade begins to concentrate very heavily. 73% in the current year of all of our trade has been the top 10 products that we send out. And if you look at the pattern over the years, we begin at 72, we're now at 73, we'll kind of move up and down in that 60 to 70% range over the full 12-year period. And that is very interesting. So this is 15% of our total export trade is accounted for in that big bar on the right-hand side. Rob Davies, our previous Minister of Trade and Industry, said African exports to the US as a whole, in fact, amounted to 1% of total US imports, with more than 60% of that made up by mineral products. And most of those mineral products out of the rest of Africa are made up of oil. Although the single biggest beneficiary under AGOA, in other words, not just our trade to the US, but our trade overall, has been South Africa's automotive sector, accounting for in and about 7% of all trade for Africa into the US under AGOA. So automotive sector, again, a big winner here. How concentrated is South Africa's trade with the US? The answer is extremely. So we have 12,621 companies exporting to the US, accounting for 100% of our trade. 26 of those traders make up 75% of all of our trade. 50% of our trade is accounted for in 6 traders, 25% with 2, 13% is a single company. And that's very interesting, because what it really says is, in the thinking of our trade policy with the US at the moment, we really concern ourselves primarily with 6 companies, creating a very interesting dynamic. So this creates quite a lot of risk, but also the flip side of that says there's a lot of opportunity for the companies that are not in there. There are large companies trading elsewhere in the world that are not represented here. Now, we don't know what the names of those companies are, but we can see the sectors that represent themselves in those top 6 companies. So the 50% of our trade that is made up of the 6 traders are in the mining sector, the automotive sector, and the chemical sector. Again, heavily concentrated. So we're going to look now at AGOA specifically. So how much of our trade is being traded under AGOA versus not under AGOA. So in US dollars, our trade with the US under AGOA has, in fact, as a percentage of our total trade with the US, has fallen from 34% to 12%. But even in absolute terms, in dollars, we are exporting less now under AGOA preference than we were in 2010. That big surge that you see on the right-hand side, making up that 88%, that is almost all platinum. And by the way, again, the big winner there is sitting in a very small number of companies. So that win on US is, you shouldn't think of a reflection on the mining industry. You should think of it as a reflection on one or two companies that have truly leveraged their competitiveness of mined platinum products into the US. In South African rands, I put this up just to stroke all of our egos. You can see the pattern there looking a little more single directional. So this is the same data we looked at before, but simply represented in South African rands, for no reason other than I wanted to show you what that difference looked like. So if we look at our pattern of trade under AGOA, what do we find ourselves looking at here? Rob Davies says AGOA preferences have led to our export baskets containing not just primary product, but some value-added goods. So let's have a look at how those value-added goods shape up in our export pattern. The top 10 products, so this is at a slightly more detailed level, are noted here. So the top 10 are vehicles, and you will see the blue block of vehicles begins to fall off. I would assume, whichever the automotive producer is, possibly the phasing out of a model, but then you see the orange block beginning to pick up, I would assume we see different models beginning to enter the US market. But the US, the top 10 products under AGOA, absolutely vehicles. And then we go down aluminium, iron and steel, all of this is good. But we drop down quite a ways before we get to wine and oranges, which we're going to spend a little bit of time on. Those are the little smudges that you see right at the very top of your graph, but are important because I believe this is where much of our growth probably resides. And same data, this time again, showing just in rands instead of dollars. So if you want to look, there's our dollar picture. And there's our rand picture, all of the graphs looking a little more robust when we represent them in rands, of course. We're not selling more agricultural products, and working through all of the data, I truly think this is the area that's probably been most neglected. The question is, why are we not selling more of these things if we are such competitive producers? Well, to start off with, I think we have to caution ourselves to not place all the blame on government. Government, in fact, in the case of AGOA, didn't really have that much to do with AGOA. The US took their position. Yes, there was some lobbying at the time, but really, the South African government didn't have that much to do with it. I think they could have done more to promote the benefits under AGOA, but be that as it may, business also has to own this. Conversations with businesses that are export focused, many companies are simply unaware of the fact that there are benefits into the US. The other thing is, we shouldn't overstate the scale of these benefits. The US has relatively low duties compared to South Africa. And even though under President Trump that started rising, and certainly President Biden has done nothing to undo that, even though the levels of protection in the US are still relatively low, we have to say, what would the harm be if those low benefits or low duties, relatively low duties, are stripped away? Well, the question would be, is our competitiveness or lack of competitiveness offset sufficiently by a reduction in the duty? So if you have a 5% duty on a product, are we only 5% inefficient at the point those goods arrive at the border or not? And I think on agricultural products, we see some success stories here. We absolutely have done really well. It's just that as a percentage of our total trade, it is still relatively small. On some of these items, like citrus, the success story is just truly very heartening. On the other hand, it succeeded well enough that our lemon juice in the US is currently subject to an anti-dumping investigation alongside Brazil. And we should be hearing preliminary results on that investigation soon. So moving on from here, we're going to quickly take a look at Chapter 8 of the tariff book. Chapter 8 of the tariff book is the fruit and nut chapter. And we've split Chapter 8 into two: the portion of Chapter 8 that benefits from AGOA and the portion that does not. So bear in mind, not everything we export to the US is a beneficiary of AGOA. And we find, if you look at the slope on this chart, we've outstripped our growth with products that do not benefit from AGOA, telling us some important pieces of information. Let's begin on the top chart. So the dark part of the orange chart is oranges. And the yellow part is everything else in Chapter 8, everything that isn't an orange that benefited from AGOA. And oranges did really well. The other product sitting in the yellow area are macadamia nuts. Without AGOA benefits, I apologize, sorry, macadamia nuts do not benefit from AGOA, my apologies. The big winner in the area without AGOA benefits has been macadamia nuts. And you can see there, those products have grown in export by 365% over this 12-year period, versus the exports with AGOA benefits that have increased by 72%. Still a very respectable number, but an important piece of information can be gleaned from this chart. This is telling us that our growth on the products that are not related to AGOA don't require AGOA benefits. They're inherently more competitive. This does not mean, of course, that the growth in the other products is because of AGOA. I've written about this recently and said identifying causality is a mix of black magic and magic mushrooms. So I'm not going to try to untangle what exactly is the cause of this, except to say that we do see faster growth fairly consistently in sectors without the benefit, which could also be seen as a big opportunity. That's the same data in rands. You can see here, both of them look a lot better, 237% up in rands on the orange juice and other goods, and 837% on the same chapter without AGOA benefits. Chapter 22 is the booze chapter. This is everything alcoholic beverages. And this has been somewhat disappointing. I had hoped our wine sector would do better here, but you can see wine is the orange part of this, and wine has been fairly flat. Other forms of alcohol being exported have in fact grown faster. All of our growth on alcohol has come from other stuff. And in the rest of Chapter 22, those products without AGOA benefits, again, up to a greater degree than those with AGOA benefits. Talking again to how much of a difference does AGOA actually make in these sectors. Same information, just to boost our egos a little bit in rands, or looks a little bit better, but of course still telling fundamentally the same story. So who has been the big winner under AGOA? And undoubtedly the biggest winner of all has been the automotive sector, who've truly utilized this as well as possible. Having said that though, a large beneficiary under AGOA, but at the aggregate level, our exports of vehicles to the US have been dropping off. Doesn't mean our exports overall are collapsing, just into the US market. The ultimate winners under AGOA have been companies without benefits. And here we see platinum. Platinum up 269%. If we have a look at this, this is both a value increase, in other words, the price of platinum has risen, but also we are selling more platinum than we did. So put together, coupled with an exchange rate looked at in rands, it truly just shot the lights out with our trade into the US. So I'd mentioned that we're looking at running into the closure of AGOA. What happens when AGOA comes to an end at the end of 2025? We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at what we can do about it, and then I'll take questions and we can have a conversation. So the first thing that's going to happen is the currently 70,000 tons or thereabout of rebated American chicken, that rebate will fall away. That's baked into the agreement we have. So the agreement says if at any time we forfeit any benefits under AGOA, that rebate automatically ends. And in fact, the South African Poultry Association has been lobbying very hard for, irrespective of what happens, to have that rebate withdrawn at the end of 2025. But that will go if AGOA disappears. What can the Americans do about it? Well, that anti-dumping duty on chicken out of the US is going to be reviewed in a few months' time. And US companies would need to look at showing that they're not dumping if they want to retain the market. And it is a very profitable market for them. South Africa spends a lot on bone-in chicken compared to almost any other country in the world. So it is a profitable market for them. But they also do have the effect of keeping chicken prices in check. And we've seen, as imported chicken into South Africa has been falling, largely because of things like bird flu, South African chicken prices have certainly been rising. By the way, on that note, our chicken prices, bone-in chicken from January last year to January this year, up 17%, compared to an average inflation rate at that point, I think, of about 4.5% in the same period. So up significantly. Of course, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, those numbers are all different. We don't have new data to make that comparison on yet. So what can we do about this? Well, we still have an intervening period between now and the end of 2025. And I do think we need to properly understand the preferences we have and focus on building a beachhead into the US market. I have read so many reports put together by many different firms complaining about the fact that the US treats South Africa unfairly with AGOA. Lots and lots of complaining. But the reality is we don't have to have AGOA. No one's obliged to give us AGOA. And just showing you the data that I've put up, we've done very little to use the benefits that we've been granted for these last 22 years. What are we going to do with the balance of this period? Well, I do think companies can grow and look at the US market as an important destination. What can be done to build a beachhead? Bear in mind, when these duties potentially, or benefits, my apologies, disappear at the end of 2025, is this enough time to have embedded yourself into a market so that you are still competitive? Will the rand potentially have depreciated enough to offset the impact over that period of the duty being removed? I don't, however, think we should be passive about this. The US is an enormous market, which we should simply be doing a lot more with. Business needs to begin lobbying for an extension of AGOA benefits for South Africa. I, again, do not think we should accept it as a foregone conclusion that this will disappear and we can do nothing about it. The US wants a free trade agreement with South Africa, which would look something similar to what we have with the EU. South Africa has been strongly opposed to that, both under Rob Davies and Ibrahim Patel. But we should probably look at an objective assessment of what such a trade agreement with the US would look like. There is a post-AGOA strategy sitting on the minister's desk at the moment, which we all eagerly await to have a look at. But what would such an agreement look like? And the answer is we simply don't know. I'm not aware of any research that has broken this down properly. Much of our views on AGOA, on trade agreements, are driven by political philosophy more than they are about economics. And it would be interesting to see what that pattern would look like before we assume it would necessarily look bad. On the other hand, and we're going to pick this up in our next webinar where we'll do a breakdown of South Africa's overall utilization of trade agreements. We don't have a great history with trade agreements. Trade agreements in South Africa tend to look more like medieval marriages than they do economic instruments. So we do things with people that we want to have some kind of alliance with at some point in time. We then do very little to promote the benefits of those agreements. We see this, by the way, manifesting even in our negotiations of the African Continental Agreement, which some of you will know I've developed quite a cynical view on. But we don't do a whole lot to make these things work. And so we wrap up our negotiations, it gets handed over to someone else, and then very little tends to happen. And business at the same time also expends very little effort on getting to know what the impact of an agreement is, how the agreements work, and what they can do with it. And so I think on both sides, we're left with a large opportunity to exploit. There's a lot of benefit of trading into the US that we're doing very little with. We have products that we're trading successfully into other regions of the world that we're not moving into the US. And I think this is an important market for us to spend some time on, irrespective of what happens with AGOA, and find what we can do to penetrate this very large, very valuable market. Thank you very much. I am up for questions.
Donald, so we have a question from Francois in the Q&A section.
Yes. Yeah, so Francois, I thought it would be heavily weighted towards a price increase, but I would go 60-40 price increase to volume increase. There's been a substantial increase in volume over the period.
All right, and we also have a question from Rejoice in the chat section.
Oh, I see that. Rejoice, I don't think it's a compliance problem. I think it's more than likely an ignorance problem. I don't think business overall understands the extent of the benefits that AGOA offers, and so don't know what to do about it. I think there are compliance requirements, but I don't think they're particularly onerous, certainly no more onerous than the EU would be. And we don't see an equivalent pattern with the EU. But I don't think South Africa just looks at the US as a feasible market that we could export to. So I had a meeting with a client a few months ago, and the comment they made to me was they had put out a proposal to supply a manufactured product into the US, but then when kind of receiving an order, they were simply unable to supply the kind of quantities that were expected. And they were not comfortable making an additional investment in their plant in South Africa with unstable electricity and all the rest of it. So they'd rather walked away from the opportunity than to make the investment. That's just an anecdote, but I'm not sure how many times that replicates. I would guess it probably is there more than once. But no, I don't think it's a compliance requirement that's prohibiting the trade. Yeah, so Sven, to your question, I think this is probably the kind of space where Business Unity South Africa and some of the industry associations has to sit down and just have a long, hard look at the US and say, is this something that matters to us? So my concern is we have very little to very close to zero economic growth in South Africa at the moment. In fact, if anything, our per capita GDP has been falling over this period. And so if you've got that kind of situation where we're just our economy is shrinking, we have to attach growth to exports because people don't have money to buy stuff in South Africa. So exports become important. And ideally, you would like to look at exports in countries that are growing more rapidly than we are, so that we attach our wagon to a horse that is walking faster than we are. But alternatively, you attach yourself even to a market that is not growing particularly fast, but where we occupy a very small space in that market. And even relatively small inroads into a US market can have a very large effect on the exporting sectors into that market. But I think industry has to get together, and I think a forum like Business Unity South Africa could be a very powerful place to try to bring people together to look at how we can approach it. Linda, what is the current status of citrus exports to the US at the moment? At some point, there was an outcry in the US that South Africa is dumping the produce. So citrus has done extremely well. Let me quickly go back a chart. Sorry. Let me quickly go back to this slide. Here. So this is in rands, that's fine. So oranges, this is not all citrus, of course, but oranges was the big winner. Oranges has been a significant winner over this period. So citrus has done well. There has been an allegation of dumping of lemon juice, so not all citrus, just lemon juice into the US. And we're not involved with that matter, so I don't personally know what is going to happen there. But chatting to the lawyers representing some of the South African firms, it is looking as if we could have a bit of a nasty outcome on that anti-dumping action, which would be a blow to us. Our lemon juice exports are nowhere near as big as what our orange exports are, for example, but certainly it would be harmful. We would have to find another home for that lemon juice, probably at a lower price, because we get a good price out of into the US for that product. So it would be harmful if we are found to be dumping, but we don't know what that answer is at the moment.